Hello there, and welcome back. I planned this topic several weeks ago, but now, in the light of a government report on structural racism, it seems rather fortuitous that I've already got a video ready on a small part of structural racism, the concept of white privilege. Do remember to share and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. So, white privilege. Like all aspects of academic literature on race, it is one that is incredibly controversial whenever and wherever it gets brought up. It will provoke arguments, furious denunciations, and a visceral sense of rage. What I want to do is first unpack the concept of white privilege and what it means, and also understand why people get so mad about it, how it fits into our social democracy, and what can be done to address the situation. Timestamps are in the video description. The theory of white privilege is that a white person in Europe and the United States, even in many former colonial nations, receives, often but not always, unconscious privilege because they are white. That's the academic basis of the theory. The key part is the unconscious side of things. It's stating that it isn't often a conscious choice but a subconscious one, that the society we built when racism was far more overt reflected this racism, and to this day perpetuates those institutional inequalities that white people benefit from without necessarily choosing to. This is something I think is very, very important to understand about this theory. At no point does it suggest that white people today are being actively racist because they benefit from this. Nor does it say that all white people will get ahead because of this issue. What it says is quite limited in scope, that a white person will never face discrimination or adverse reactions on an institutional level because of their skin colour. That a white person will be treated more favourably by institutions because of their whiteness. The most common rebuttal to this theory is to point to someone in a caravan park who is dirt poor and white, commonly referred to through the slur white trash. Say your stereotype of an Alabama man living on a farm, badly educated, very poor, and often has little prospects beyond eking out a sad, pathetic existence. This stereotype of a man is held up as the example for why white privilege cannot exist. Yet, it ignores the key tenet of white privilege, that this person will never be stopped by the police for being white. They will never have the police called on them for simply being in a space whilst white. They will never be denied a job because they are white. Heck, they will never be denied a callback because their name is too ethnic. That is white privilege. This Alabama man and everyone like him, such as Mondeo man in Britain and other such stereotypes across the European and American world, will all never face discrimination based on their colour. They may and frequently will face discrimination based upon their class, but that is also present for most ethnic minorities because the legacy of structural racism has resulted in most ethnic minorities living in poor socio-economic circumstances. There is a clear intersection between race and class. This is not and has never been disputed by any academic literature that examines race and class, but it doesn't disprove that race is still a factor in of itself, which is what the theory of white privilege states. The concept of white privilege is a deep concept. It is an academic concept. Nobody seriously wants white people everywhere to suddenly start apologising for their privilege, because at the end of the day, unless you're actively attempting to try and build a white ethno-state, you're just living your life and doing your best. It isn't your fault that this system exists. What ethnic minorities want is a recognition that this system exists and honest attempts to try and change it, instead of stubbornly reacting like this.
I've earned everything I've got.
Why does this concept receive such a visceral reaction? To put it bluntly, it makes people feel like they haven't earned what they have, that the basis of their success is a lie, that their failure is even worse. It hits people in their pride, and that nearly always stings. It's why it's such an effective tool for the right. It's a deeply emotional topic for so many people. It also stems from a lack of understanding about how our society works. In the US, the American dream mythos is all-powerful and most predominantly believed amongst those who are white. So the idea that something structural stands in the way of ethnic minorities and prevents a level playing field contradicts not only their own view of how they reached their positions, but also their entire worldview in how they believe their society functions. It's the same in the United Kingdom. Nobody wants to believe that the United Kingdom has not shed its colonial past and has not failed at stopping the vestiges of racism that still exist in our society. People want to believe that we live in a good, just and righteous society, because then we can believe we are good, just and righteous people, and by extension have earned everything we have in our life, that we are where we are supposed to be. Many of those on the right view racism through the lens of individual agency, that if individuals are racist and you stop their racism, the burden then falls upon the individual to use their agency to rise up because the barrier has been removed. This is the premise underpinning the Sewell report, published a few days ago to such outrage in the United Kingdom. Modern academia has moved away from that theory in favour of the theory of institutional racism, stating that the structures set up are built upon the legacy of racism, and that has not been scoured, meaning through institutional inertia, racial bias remains. This can be evidenced through the transition between good grades for minorities but a continuing lack of good outcomes in employment and other such areas. In academia, the theory of institutional racism and, through it, white privilege is no longer in dispute, such is the weight of evidence behind it. It's only controversial outside of academia. The point of contention is whether that agency applies. Almost every academic study conducted shows clear evidence of structural racism, and because of that, white privilege. The recent report by the UK government is the outlier in this regard in transferring the responsibility of getting past racism onto the individual rather than understanding the institutional factors that result in significantly higher bars being put on ethnic minorities. It has been suggested that this is a cynical ploy to divide the opposition between their principles and tactical necessity, whilst also sparking a culture war in a very similar vein to Trump, Orban and others. I would say that even if the society we live in is not a perfectly good, just and righteous society, it does not mean that individual actors, that is you and I, are not good people. In fact, you can still be a good person inside a system that isn't good, nor does it mean you haven't worked hard for what you have. Recognising that our system does not function and holds down people of a different class or race or gender means that we have work to do to make things better, and we can make it better. Discrimination is not an inevitability. Let's look at how discrimination fits inside democracy. Our social democracy is built upon the idea that a meritocracy exists, that the best people should rise to the highest positions because of their ability and their achievements. That inherited privilege should not guarantee a person a place at the top table because that would render the system inefficient and unfair. This belief is common across left and right, socialist and capitalist. The divergence is often how best this is delivered. Those on the left tend to take a more institutional approach, with the idea that through laws and regulations you can make this process fairer. And those on the right argue that if you remove laws and regulations, the market will guarantee that the best rise to the top because it is otherwise inefficient to do so. White privilege shows clearly that this isn't the case, that it's far, far easier for a less talented white person to advance further and quicker than it is for a talented person of an ethnic minority. The CV studies alone show that equally qualified minorities with minority-sounding names receive far fewer callbacks than more stereotypically white-sounding names. This is compounded when inside firms, the image of a manager in many people's heads tends to be a white male. This unconscious bias then leads to fewer opportunities for talented ethnic minorities, and that translates to less and less opportunities the further up the ladder you go. This unconscious bias explains why ethnic minorities tend to be in far more violent interactions with the police, why ethnic minorities receive harsher criminal sentences, why they're more likely to be stopped, and why it is harder to get into positions of power. This is made significantly worse because of a backlash effect which has been documented, albeit with sexism the viewpoint, but I believe this can easily be transferred to ethnic minorities. The findings of this study was that when women's representation is increased, men often overestimate the amount of representation and believe they are then in a minority, and the drive to increase representation should therefore be halted. This often happens with ethnic minority representation too, with the far right then playing up the Great Replacement lie to drum up fear of whiteness being at risk, and that somehow that translates to a threat to civilization, even though diversity tends to be a good thing for the economy and society. The more we are exposed to different traditions, ideas, thoughts, beliefs, even ways of working, the more we can innovate. Humans are inherently social creatures, and it is through our collaborative instinct that we progress. So when we create a system that locks out people who are different, we're making our own societies poorer, weaker, and less vibrant. It also leads to a dangerous state of affairs where minorities within feel like they are not of the nation, and this feeling of othering can be turned and used by demagogues to drive up hatred of the other. Social democracy already has the tools needed to remove these institutional issues, because at its heart, almost all leftist traditions are continual reformers, in that problems that are brought forward should be addressed. This is a basic core of the social contract as the left sees it. The problem is that it requires a nuanced understanding of people, structures, and institutions, and it requires legislation that is incredibly unpopular. Unconscious bias training is hugely controversial because nobody wants to believe they've got biases, so it's not very politically expedient, at least with the current way attitudes are, but it's something that needs to shift if we are to deliver on the promise of a truly meritocratic society. How can we fix it? This is difficult because all the simplest measures are also the most unpopular measures, some even bordering on unfair, such as quotas or affirmative action. Unconscious bias training, as I mentioned, continual reform, and trying to have an honest look at the state of our societies. The first step to fixing problems is recognising that these problems actually exist, and then using academia and combining it with lived experience to reconcile how our society should operate and how it does operate. Once we know what is happening where, we can start to steadily eliminate the biases that cause so much institutional harm. Nowhere does this mean cancelling white people, or getting rid of people's jobs, or trying to tear down people. It simply means delivering on that implicit promise of our democracy, giving everyone a fair opportunity to succeed. Thank you for listening. If you like the content, help the channel grow by sharing and subscribing. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments or on my Discord server, which is linked in the comments and the description. I'll see you next week. Thank you and goodbye.